shy millionaire silently loved her for 6 years, but never told her until he saw her dating another man. Hi, my most precious, beautiful family. Before anything, let's hold hands in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this loving family. Please heal me fully and bless every soul watching. Surround us with love, protection, and peace. Amen. This is your Mr. Peter. I'm still in New York for treatment, but by God's grace, I'll be back in 2 days. I feel your love deeply, and I miss you more than words can say. My sweet family, please listen. If you see my videos on any other channel, they are stolen. People are copying my voice, editing my work, and pretending to be me. Please report and unsubscribe from them. Only this channel is our true home. To all my new beautiful family members, welcome with all my heart. You matter. You belong here. Please introduce yourself in the comments. Your voice is important to me, and I kindly ask, please don't leave the story midway. If the intro feels long, skip it, but don't skip the love. Your one like and comment can protect our channel and keep us alive. While I rest, James will be with you. Now let's begin the story with all the love in the world.
Love, they say, is blind, but for Greg Morrison, love had perfect vision. It could see across impossible distances through glass and time and the careful walls people build around their hearts. It just came with the exquisite torture of silence. The first light of dawn painted Miami's skyline in shades of liquid amber and rose gold, transforming Biscayne Bay into a mirror that reflected heaven itself. From his penthouse balcony, Greg Morrison commanded a view that had cost him $12 million and earned him the envy of every real estate mogul in Florida. But he wasn't watching the spectacular sunrise that tourists traveled thousands of miles to witness. His dark eyes were fixed on a single balcony across the courtyard, where in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the center of his universe would appear, Penny Lane. Her name was poetry to him, though he'd learned it not through introduction but through stolen glances at mail deliveries and fragments of conversation that drifted up from the courtyard below like answered prayers. At 34, Greg had built an empire that stretched across 3 states, commanded respect in boardrooms filled with titans of industry, and wielded the kind of power that could reshape city skylines. Yet every morning for the past 6 years, he stood on this balcony like a monk at morning prayer, waiting for a glimpse of the woman who had unknowingly become his religion. At exactly 7 a.m., the sliding door of apartment 10B whispered open with the sound that had become the most beautiful music in his world. She emerged like sunrise given human form. Penny stepped onto her balcony carrying her favorite ceramic mug, robin's egg blue with tiny white forget-me-nots that she'd owned for at least 4 years. Years, based on his careful cataloging of her daily rituals. At 32, she moved with the unconscious grace of someone who carried light within her, each gesture a small masterpiece of natural elegance that made Greg's chest tighten with the sweet agony of distant love. Her hair caught the morning breeze like silk ribbons, and she wore a simple white cotton nightgown that fluttered around her like she was some ethereal being who'd chosen to briefly inhabit the mortal world. As she stretched her arms toward the awakening sky, Greg felt the familiar lightning strike of recognition. There is the reason the sun rises. There is the purpose of morning light. "Good morning, my beautiful angel," he whispered to the wind, the same greeting he'd offered her for over 2,000 consecutive days. It was the closest he'd ever come to speaking to her, this daily declaration of love that traveled across courtyard and silence to bless the beginning of her day, even though she'd never know it existed. She began her morning ritual, the sacred choreography that Greg had memorized like scripture. First, she checked each plant in her small garden with the devoted attention of someone who understood that nurturing life was a privilege. She hummed while she worked, a soft, unconscious melody that drifted across the courtyard and wrapped around Greg's heart like silk scarves. He'd never been able to identify the tune, but it had become the soundtrack to his dreams, the music his soul recognized as home. Through binoculars he kept hidden behind a decorative planter and felt thoroughly ashamed about needing, Greg had memorized every detail of her morning routine. The way she always tested the soil with her fingertips before watering, how she whispered encouragement to struggling seedlings, the peaceful smile that graced her lips as she watched the city wake up 15 stories below. She was checking her phone now, probably reading emails for her community organization. He'd researched the Overtown Community Development Foundation extensively, had made substantial anonymous donations that kept her programs running and her dreams alive. It was the only way he could be part of her world without disrupting its perfect harmony. "Mr. Morrison, your coffee's ready." Khalil Reed's voice carried the fond exasperation of a man who'd spent 3 years trying to convince his employer that love required more courage than real estate acquisitions. At 28, Khalil had evolved from assistant to therapist to the closest thing Greg's introverted soul allowed to friendship. This morning he wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, but it was his knowing expression that caught Greg's attention. "You're doing it again," Khalil said, setting down the coffee with ceremony. "That thing where you stare across the courtyard like you're trying to communicate through the power of pure longing." "I'm not staring, I'm observing. Boss, I have a psychology degree from Georgetown and 3 years of watching you pine like a Victorian poet. You're staring." Khalil's voice carried the gentle affection of someone who'd given up trying to change his employer's romantic masochism. "She's extraordinary, by the way. I can see why you've been completely hopeless at dating anyone else since I've known you." Heat crawled up Greg's neck. "I don't—" "Elena Vasquez," Khalil interrupted with surgical precision. "The gallery owner who practically proposed to you last year?" "You spent the entire dinner talking about a woman who truly understands community service and checking your phone to see if you'd missed her evening routine. Poor woman thought you were secretly married. Elena was lovely, but she wasn't Penny Lane." Khalil pulled out his phone and began scrolling with theatrical casualness. "You know, normal people have dating apps. They go to bars. They ask their attractive neighbors for coffee like civilized human beings instead of conducting 6-year surveillance operations." "Normal people," Greg replied quietly, his eyes never leaving Penny's graceful form. "Don't fall in love with someone's soul before they know their voice." The simple truth silenced Khalil's teasing, replacing it with something gentler. After a moment, he said, "You know what I think? I think you're terrified that if you actually meet her, she might not live up to the goddess you've imagined. Or worse, you might not live up to the man she deserves." The observation hit uncomfortably close to truth, and Greg's silence confirmed it. "But here's what you're missing," Khalil continued, his voice taking on the firm tone he used when dispensing wisdom disguised as conversation. "You've been imagining conversations with her for 6 years. You've supported her work anonymously, protected her from dangers she never knew existed, and loved her with more devotion than most married couples manage in a lifetime. Maybe it's time to find out if she's capable of recognizing that kind of love when she sees it." Across the courtyard, Penny was finishing her routine, gathering her gardening tools with the efficient grace that made even mundane tasks look like poetry. In 15 minutes, she would shower and dress for work in one of her simple but elegant outfits. She favored earth tones and flowing fabrics that made her look like a goddess visiting from a more beautiful world. He'd seen her in professional blazers for important meetings, casual sundresses for weekend community events, and once, memorably, in a stunning red gown at a fundraising gala, where he'd watched her from across the room like a shadow guarding light. "Did you know," Greg said softly, that 18 months ago someone tried to break into her apartment. She was reading on her balcony when she heard glass breaking. Instead of hiding, she grabbed a baseball bat and confronted the intruder, chased him right out through her front door and halfway down the block. Khalil raised an eyebrow. "You witnessed this dramatic home invasion." "I called the police. Anonymous tip. They caught him 6 blocks away with her neighbor's stolen jewelry." Pride colored Greg's voice. She never knew she had backup, never knew someone was watching over her safety. That's the kind of woman she is, brave enough to face danger alone, strong enough to protect herself, but deserving of someone who would stand guard over her peace, even when she doesn't need it. And yet you still haven't found the courage to say hello. The words stung because they illuminated the central contradiction of Greg's existence. A man bold enough to reshape city skylines, but paralyzed by the thought of approaching a woman with kind eyes and a generous heart. "You don't understand," Greg said, his voice barely audible over the morning breeze. "I've been in love with her for so long that she's become everything. She's the reason sunrise has meaning, the face I see before sleep, the standard by which I measure every choice I make. I've imagined 1,000 conversations with her, pictured holding her hand during storms, dreamed of making her laugh." His hands gripped the balcony railing until his knuckles went white. "What if I approach her and she's nothing like I've imagined? What if the reality of knowing her destroys the dream that's kept me alive for 6 years? What if I'm just another man who wants something from her, instead of the guardian angel I've tried to be?" "And what if," Khalil countered gently, "she's exactly as wonderful as you think, and you're exactly the kind of man she's been hoping to find? What if 6 years of loving her from a distance has prepared you to love her up close, better than any man ever could?" But Greg was shaking his head, already retreating from hope before it could wound him again. "Look at me, Khalil. Really look. I watch her from balconies like some character from a Gothic novel. I know her schedule better than she does. I've been anonymously influencing her life for years. If I told her all of that, she'd think I was insane. Or," Khalil said softly, "she'd think you were a man who fell in love with her kindness and wanted to support her dreams even when you couldn't be part of them." Across the courtyard, Penny was heading inside, her morning ritual complete. The golden light that had made her look like a Renaissance painting was fading into ordinary daylight, but the ache in Greg's chest remained as fresh as it had been 6 years ago when he'd first seen her tend her garden with such gentle devotion. In 3 hours, she would emerge dressed for work, carrying her laptop bag and the kind of determined expression that meant she was planning to change someone's life for the better. Tonight she would return home carrying groceries and flowers, maybe stopping to chat with neighbors or help an elderly resident with heavy bags. And through it all, she would remain completely unaware that a man who loved her more than his own life was watching over every moment, protecting what he could never possess. "I have the Coral Gables project meeting at 10, Greg said, straightening his tie in the reflection of the sliding glass door. The man looking back at him was successful, impeccably dressed and profoundly empty despite having everything money could buy. "Yes, sir. And your evening?" Greg's evening would be the same as every evening for the past 6 years. He would return home around 7, position himself on this balcony with a book or his laptop, and hope for another glimpse of the woman who had unknowingly shaped every day of his adult life. He would watch her cook dinner, talk to friends on the phone, water her plants in the golden hour before sunset. He would fall asleep to the memory of her smile and wake up counting hours until he could see her again. "Evening's free," he said, knowing it was both truth and lie. His evening belonged to Penny Lane, just like every evening for the past 6 years, just like every evening for the rest of his life, if that's what loving her required. As the elevator carried him down to a day of meetings and million-dollar decisions, Greg Morrison carried with him the image that had sustained him through over 2,000 mornings. Penny Lane greeting the sunrise with grace and joy, unknowingly giving purpose to a man whose heart had been hers from the moment he'd first seen her tend her garden with love. Somewhere across the courtyard, behind windows that reflected his own building back at him, lived the woman who was someone's entire universe. And somewhere in his chest, his heart whispered the same prayer it had whispered every morning for 6 years. Please let today be different. Please let me find the courage to cross that impossible distance. Please let me be worthy of the love I've been saving for her. But as the day began in earnest, Greg Morrison already knew that today would be like yesterday, and tomorrow would be the same. He was a man who owned half of Miami but couldn't find the courage to walk across a courtyard. A man who had everything except the only thing that mattered. And 15 stories above the city, an empty balcony waited for tomorrow's sunrise, when love would once again keep its patient vigil across an impossible distance, hoping that someday, somehow, silence might finally find its voice. Chapter 2. The Light Across the Way. To fall in love with someone's soul through silent observation is to discover that beauty lives not in perfection, but in the 1,000 small moments when someone thinks they're unobserved. Greg's day moved with the mechanical precision of a man whose heart lived 15 stories above the city, waiting for evening to return him to his only source of joy. The Coral Gables meeting had generated another few million in contracts. The lunch with investors had secured funding for 3 new developments, but his mind remained anchored to a single question. What is she doing right now? By 6:15 p.m., he was back on his balcony, positioned in his leather chair with a glass of Bordeaux and financial reports spread across the side table, a carefully constructed facade of productivity that fooled no one, least of all himself. In reality, every cell in his body was attuned to the moment when apartment 10B would transform from empty space into the center of his universe. At 6:28 p.m., the miracle happened. Penny's door opened and she stepped into her apartment, carrying groceries and a bouquet of white peonies that seemed to glow against her coral-colored dress. Even from his distance, Greg could see exhaustion in the careful way she set down her bags. But there was something else, a quiet dignity in how she moved through her space, as if grace were simply her natural state. Through her sliding glass doors, he watched her begin the evening ritual he'd memorized like a prayer. First, the flowers. She always chose a single stem for the small crystal vase beside her reading chair. Arranged the rest in the blue ceramic pitcher that had somehow survived 6 years and 2 moves without losing its chip. Her movements were economical but never hurried, each gesture carrying the unconscious beauty of someone who found joy in simple tasks. Tonight, however, something was different. Instead of humming the soft melody she usually sang while arranging flowers, a tune Greg had never been able to identify but would recognize instantly in a crowd of thousands, Penny worked in silence. Her face, typically animated with small smiles and expressions that suggested pleasant thoughts, was still as winter water. She moved to her small kitchen and began unpacking groceries with mechanical precision that lacked her usual thoughtful organization. Normally, this process was almost meditative for her. She would read every label, arrange items by color and height, often pausing to sample a strawberry or smell the fresh herbs she brought home from the farmer's market every Saturday. Tonight, she simply transferred items from bags to shelves without seeming to see them. The white peonies sat forgotten on her counter, still wrapped in brown paper. Greg leaned forward, every instinct sharpened by 6 years of reading her moods in the tilt of her shoulders, the rhythm of her movements, the way she held her head. This wasn't ordinary tiredness. This was the posture of someone carrying invisible weight, fighting a battle no one else could see. She finished with the groceries and stood motionless in her kitchen, one hand braced against the marble counter, her head bowed as if gravity had suddenly become too much to bear. Through the glass, Greg could see her lips moving slightly, Not speech, but the kind of silent conversation people have with themselves when trying to make sense of senseless things. "What's wrong, beautiful?" he whispered to the evening air, the same question he'd asked her face 1,000 times in dreams. "What's dimming your light tonight?" As if summoned by his concern, Penny's phone rang. She stared at it for 4 rings before answering, and even across the courtyard, Greg could read reluctance in every line of her body. When she finally lifted the device to her ear, her free hand immediately went to her throat, a gesture he'd observed whenever she received difficult news. The conversation lasted 7 minutes and 38 seconds. Greg timed it unconsciously, the way he'd begun measuring all the significant moments of her life. He watched her face change as she listened, confusion shifting to understanding, understanding darkening into something that looked like grief. When she hung up, Penny remained frozen for a long moment, still holding the phone as if it might ring again with different news, better news, news that would restore the equilibrium someone had just shattered. Then, with the careful movements of someone afraid they might break, she set the phone on her counter and walked to her sliding doors. She stepped onto her balcony just as the sun was setting over Biscayne Bay, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose gold that turned her skin luminous. But instead of the peaceful appreciation she usually showed for Miami's spectacular sunsets, Penny gripped her balcony railing with white knuckles and simply breathed. Deep, controlled breaths that suggested she was fighting tears through sheer force of will. For 23 minutes, she stood there in the dying light, and Greg bore witness to her private battle with whatever demon the phone call had delivered. He watched her shoulders shake with suppressed emotion, saw her press her lips together to stop them from trembling, witnessed the exact moment when her careful composure finally shattered. The tears came silently at first, just a glimmer on her cheeks in the fading sunlight. Then deeper grief took hold, and her entire body curved inward as if protecting itself from blows only she could feel. These weren't the quick tears of frustration or the bittersweet emotion of a touching movie. This was soul-deep sorrow, the kind that carved permanent channels in the heart. Greg was on his feet before conscious thought, moving toward his front door with 6 years of protective instinct overriding every rational consideration. He would cross that courtyard, climb those stairs, and somehow make this right. He stopped with his hand on the doorknob, reality crashing over him like ice water. What was he going to do? Announce that he'd been watching her cry from his balcony? Confess to 6 years of silent observation and claim the right to comfort her? She would call the police, and she would be right to do so. The truth hit him with devastating clarity. For all his accumulated love, for all the intimacy he felt with her daily rhythms and small rituals, he was still a stranger to her, a man who didn't even have the right to know she was suffering, much less the privilege of easing her pain. By 9:15 p.m., as if summoned by supernatural intuition, Diamond Rhodes appeared at Penny's door, carrying Thai food and what looked like an emergency bottle of wine. Greg watched through the windows as Diamond took one look at her friend's tear-stained face and immediately set down her bags to wrap Penny in the kind of fierce hug that said, "Whatever this is, we'll survive it together." Diamond was a force of nature, tall and commanding, even in jeans and a simple sweater, with expressive hands that painted pictures in the air when she talked, and a laugh that could probably be heard 3 blocks away. She moved through Penny's apartment with the confidence of someone who'd been granted unlimited access to her friend's space and heart, automatically dimming harsh lights and lighting candles to create a more comforting atmosphere. At 9:45, Yuri Cross arrived with additional reinforcements, ice cream, tissues, and the kind of vintage scarves she wrapped around everything, including, Greg noticed with a small smile, Penny's shoulders as she guided her to the couch. Yuri was Diamond's opposite in many ways, petite where Diamond was tall, soft-spoken where Diamond was bold. but together they formed a protective circle around Penny that spoke of years of friendship and countless shared crises. Through the windows, Greg watched the three women settle into what was clearly a well-practiced ritual of emotional triage. Diamond gestured passionately while speaking, probably offering solutions or righteous indignation on Penny's behalf. Yuri listened with the focused attention of someone who knew that sometimes being heard was more important than being advised. And Penny, curled between them like a wounded bird, slowly began to unfurl as their combined love worked its healing magic. Around 11 p.m., the tenor of their gathering shifted from crisis management to something warmer. Greg could see Penny actually smiling, tentatively at first, then with growing strength as Diamond launched into what appeared to be an elaborate story involving dramatic reenactment. By 11:30, all three women were laughing, and the sound of Penny's genuine joy floating across the courtyard made Greg's chest ache with bittersweet relief. This was her world, a universe of deep friendships, unconditional support, and people who loved her enough to drop everything when she needed them. It was a world where her gentle strength was cherished and protected, where her tears mattered to people who had earned the right to dry them. It was a world that had no place for a man who loved her from shadows. By midnight, Diamond and Yuri were preparing to leave, but not before an elaborate series of goodbye hugs, whispered reassurances, and the kind of lingering concern that suggested they would be checking on her again tomorrow. Greg watched them extract promises from Penny, probably commitments to call if she needed anything, agreements to take better care of herself, vows not to face whatever crisis had shattered her evening alone. Finally, she was alone again, moving through her apartment with slower but steadier steps than she'd managed earlier. Whatever support her friends had provided, it had helped restore some essential equilibrium. In her bedroom, the room that faced away from Greg's building, a soft glow appeared, suggesting she was reading before sleep. Greg remained on his balcony until her light went out at 12:52 a.m., a guardian she would never know she had, watching over her rest with the devotion of a man whose heart had been entrusted to someone who didn't even know his name. As he finally headed inside, one truth echoed in the silence. He loved her enough to want her happiness more than his own recognition, her peace more than his proximity, her well-being more than his desperate desire to be part of her world. Tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., she would emerge on her balcony again, and he would be there to witness it. She would tend her garden, greet the sunrise, and slowly restore the radiant equilibrium that made her the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. And he would fall in love with her all over again, just as he had every day for the past 6 years, from a distance that felt simultaneously infinite and as close as his own heartbeat. Chapter 3. The Serpent Enters Paradise. Evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. It usually arrives wearing a perfect smile and carrying expensive flowers. 3 weeks had passed since the night Greg watched Penny cry herself to sleep, and he'd begun to hope that whatever crisis had shaken her world was resolving itself. Her morning routines had returned to normal, the peaceful garden tending, the gentle smile as she watched the sun rise, the unconscious grace that made his heart skip every single day. She seemed lighter again, more like the woman he'd fallen in love with from across the courtyard. That illusion shattered on a Friday evening at 7:43 p.m., when Greg saw a man walk Penny to her apartment door. At first, his heart simply stopped. In 6 years of vigilant observation, Greg had never seen Penny bring a date home. She'd had dinner companions, work colleagues, and the occasional male friend from her community organization, but never someone who stood close enough to suggest romantic interest. Never someone who made her laugh in that particular way that suggested attraction. The man was tall, impeccably dressed in what looked like a designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Even from 15 floors up, Greg could see the confident way he carried himself, the practiced charm in his gestures as he talked to Penny outside her door. When the man turned slightly, Greg caught a glimpse of his profile, and his blood turned to ice. Rob Spooner was a predator disguised as perfection. At 36, he possessed the kind of devastating handsomeness that made women forget to breathe. Sharp jawline, eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul, and a smile that promised he found you absolutely fascinating. More dangerous than his looks was his intelligence. An MBA from Wharton, a senior position at Miami's most exclusive marketing firm, and the kind of social connections that opened every door in the city. But Greg knew what Rob really was. He'd heard the whispered stories at country clubs, the carefully buried rumors among business circles. Rob collected successful women like some men collected vintage cars, beautiful acquisitions to be polished, displayed, and then methodically destroyed when he grew bored. The pattern was always the same: identification, seduction, isolation, financial entanglement, psychological demolition, and finally abandonment among the ruins of what had once been a promising life. What made him truly terrifying wasn't his cruelty, it was his patience. Rob could spend months studying a target, learning her vulnerabilities, mapping her insecurities, identifying exactly which psychological buttons to push. He didn't just break women, he made them complicit in their own destruction, convincing them that every devastating decision was their own choice. And now he'd set his sights on Penny. Greg watched in helpless fury as Rob deployed his opening moves with surgical precision. The man didn't just introduce himself to Penny, he made her feel like she was the most interesting person he'd ever met. Every gesture was calculated, the way he leaned forward when she spoke, suggesting complete fascination. How he touched her arm at exactly the right moments to create intimate connection without seeming aggressive. The slight, vulnerable confession about his demanding work schedule that made him seem successful but emotionally available. Most chilling was Rob's smile when Penny turned away to refresh their drinks. For just an instant, his charming expression slipped into something cold and predatory, the look of a hunter who just confirmed his prey's weakness. Then Penny returned, and the mask snapped back into place with terrifying efficiency. Rob knew exactly what he was doing, and Penny, with her generous heart and trusting nature, was walking straight into his trap. That night, Greg lay awake until 3 a.m., staring at his ceiling and trying to convince himself that he was overreacting. Maybe Rob had changed. Maybe the rumors about his past were exaggerated. Maybe Penny's goodness would be the thing that finally tamed whatever darkness lived in Rob Spooner's heart. But by Saturday morning, as Greg resumed his vigil on the balcony, he knew he was fooling himself. Men like Rob Spooner didn't change. They just got better at hiding their true nature until their victims were too emotionally invested to escape. At 7 a.m. sharp, Penny emerged for her morning routine, but everything was different. She moved with the unconscious happiness of a woman who'd spent the evening thinking about a man's smile, replaying conversations, and wondering when her phone might ring. Instead of her usual quiet contemplation as she tended her garden, she kept glancing at her phone, clearly hoping for a text message that would brighten her already glowing mood. Greg's phone buzzed with a text from his friend Zemir Rivers. Business breakfast at the Setai? Need to discuss the Brickell project. Normally, Greg would have agreed immediately. Zemir was one of the few people who knew about his real estate empire's full scope, and their business partnerships had made them both even wealthier over the years. But this morning, the idea of leaving his balcony felt impossible. What if Rob showed up while he wasn't watching? What if Penny needed someone to witness whatever manipulation was about to begin? Can't today. Personal matter, he texted back, knowing Zemir would understand. The man had been trying to get Greg to date for years and would probably assume he'd finally found someone willing to put up with his shy intensity. By 10 a.m., Greg's worst fears were confirmed. Rob appeared at Penny's door carrying a single red rose and what looked like expensive takeout from one of Miami's most exclusive restaurants. This time she invited him inside, and Greg watched through her windows as they shared what appeared to be an intimate brunch on her small dining table. Rob's body language was masterful. He leaned forward as if fascinated by every word Penny spoke, gestured expressively when telling his own stories, and found excuses to touch her hand or shoulder in ways that seemed casual but were clearly calculated. Greg had read about this phase of Rob's technique in an article written by one of his victims, the love bombing period when Rob became everything a woman had ever dreamed of in a partner. What made it worse was seeing how Penny responded. Her natural warmth and openness, the very qualities that had made Greg fall in love with her, were being weaponized against her. She laughed at Rob's jokes, leaned into his casual touches, and gazed at him with the kind of trust that it had taken Greg 6 years of distant observation to recognize as precious beyond measure. Around noon, Rob left, but not before kissing Penny's cheek with just enough lingering contact to suggest he wanted more but was respectfully waiting for her to set the pace. It was a perfect move, the kind of restraint that would make a woman like Penny feel safe and valued rather than pursued for purely physical reasons. That afternoon, Greg made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed over 6 years of careful distance. He called Shay Blake, a lawyer friend who specialized in corporate litigation but had connections throughout Miami's legal community. "Shay, I need information about someone," Greg said without preamble when his friend answered. "Rob Spooner. I need to know everything. Business dealings, personal history, anything that might not be public knowledge." "Rob Spooner." Shay's voice carried a note of surprise. "Why are you interested in that piece of work? Please tell me you're not thinking about going into business with him." "Nothing like that. Just, someone I care about is getting involved with him, and I have a bad feeling." There was a pause on the line. "Greg, how well do you know this woman? Because if she's the kind of person you'd care about, she's exactly the kind of target Rob goes for." "What do you mean?" "Successful women. Independent, compassionate, financially stable. He seems to get off on taking strong women and systematically breaking them down. I know at least 3 attorneys who've represented his victims in various matters: restraining orders, financial recovery, psychological damage claims. Nothing that stuck legally, but the pattern is clear." Greg's grip tightened on his phone. "How clear?" "Clear enough that there's an unofficial warning network among certain circles. We try to discreetly alert women when they get involved with him, but he's charming as hell and usually manages to convince them that his exes are just bitter." Shay paused again. "Who is she, Greg?" "Someone you're dating." "Someone I—" Greg struggled with how to explain his situation. "Someone I've known for a long time but never had the courage to approach. And now it might be too late." "It's never too late until she's married to him. But you need to be careful about how you handle this. Rob is smart, well-connected, and vindictive as hell when someone interferes with his plans. If you're going to protect this woman, you need solid evidence and a bulletproof strategy." That evening, Greg positioned himself on his balcony with military precision. His laptop open to financial databases, and his phone loaded with contact information for 3 private investigators he'd used for business purposes. If Rob Spooner thought he could destroy Penny Lane's life for sport, he was about to discover that some people fought back. At 6:45 p.m., Rob arrived again, this time carrying a bottle of what looked like very expensive champagne and a small wrapped box that made Greg's heart sink. Jewelry, probably. Something beautiful and expensive that would make Penny feel special and valued while simultaneously creating a sense of obligation. Through her sliding doors, Greg watched as Penny opened the gift, a delicate silver bracelet that caught the light as she held it up. Her smile was radiant as Rob fastened it around her wrist, and when he asked her something that made her nod enthusiastically, Greg knew his worst nightmare was beginning to unfold. They were making plans, probably for a proper dinner date, maybe a weekend getaway, definitely for a deeper level of involvement that would give Rob more access to Penny's heart and mind. Every step was designed to isolate her further from her support system while making her more dependent on Rob's approval and attention. That night, after Rob left and Penny's lights went out at 11:30 p.m., Greg remained on his balcony until dawn, planning his own strategy. He couldn't approach Penny directly, not yet, not without evidence she couldn't dismiss as jealousy or delusion. But he could investigate Rob Spooner with the same methodical thoroughness that had built his real estate empire. By sunrise, Greg Morrison had transformed from a lovesick observer into something far more dangerous. A man with unlimited resources, powerful connections, and 6 years' worth of protective love that was finally finding its purpose. Rob Spooner had chosen the wrong target. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 4. Watching love turn to poison. The cruelest torture ever devised is to watch someone you love being slowly erased by someone who claims to adore them, especially when you're the only witness to the murder of their soul. The first week of Rob's courtship was a masterpiece of seduction disguised as devotion, and Greg had the agonizing privilege of watching every calculated move from his balcony observatory. Monday brought orchids, not the common varieties sold in grocery stores, but rare Paphiopedilum specimens that cost more than most people's rent and required the kind of specialized care that would bind Penny to daily reminders of Rob's generosity. Greg watched through his binoculars as she received the delivery, her face lighting up with genuine wonder as she read the accompanying card that undoubtedly contained some perfectly crafted romantic sentiment. For 43 minutes, she photographed the flowers from every angle, clearly planning to share her joy with friends. But something Rob had written made her hesitate before posting. Greg could see her typing and deleting, until finally she put her phone away without sharing anything at all. The first seed of isolation, planted so subtly she probably didn't even notice it taking root. Tuesday brought chocolates from Leonidas in Brussels, delivered precisely at 2:14 p.m., when Rob somehow knew Penny would be taking her lunch break. Greg had observed her schedule for years and knew she always ate at her desk between 1:45 and 2:15, usually a simple salad while reviewing grant applications. The expensive chocolates arrived just as she was finishing her meal, and through her apartment windows, Greg watched her take a photo of the elegant gold box. But again, no social media post. Rob's influence was already teaching her that joy shared with others somehow diminished joy shared with him. Wednesday brought the predator himself. Rob arrived at 7 p.m. carrying dinner from Zuma and wine that probably cost more than Penny's monthly grocery budget. Through her sliding glass doors, Greg was forced to witness the evening that would haunt his dreams for weeks. Penny and Rob dining by candlelight at her small table, their conversation flowing like a perfectly choreographed dance of attraction and discovery. But Greg saw what Penny couldn't, the moments between Rob's charming smiles when his expression went cold and calculating, the way his eyes swept her apartment with the assessment of an appraiser cataloging valuable assets, how he subtly positioned himself between Penny and her phone when it buzzed with evening messages from friends, creating a physical barrier between her and the outside world. Most chilling was watching Rob's technique unfold with surgical precision. When Penny mentioned her upcoming presentation to the city council about expanding affordable housing, Rob leaned forward with apparent fascination, asking detailed questions that seemed like genuine interest but were actually intelligence gathering. By the end of the evening, he knew her project timeline, funding sources, and which city officials supported her work, information that a man planning her destruction would find invaluable. Thursday brought flowers again, but this time Rob had learned her preferences through Tuesday's careful observation. White peonies, the exact variety she'd been carrying the night Greg had watched her cry. The symbolism was devastatingly perfect. Rob was positioning himself as the solution to whatever crisis had brought those tears, the man who paid attention and remembered what mattered to her. Greg watched Penny arrange the peonies in her blue ceramic pitcher, the same vessel she'd used for flowers since moving in 6 years ago. But something about her movements had changed. She kept glancing toward her phone, clearly hoping for a text from Rob, her natural rhythm disrupted by the artificial dependency he was carefully cultivating. Friday brought Rob's first overnight stay, and Greg spent the longest night of his adult life pacing his penthouse like a caged wolf. Through her windows, he could see Rob moving through Penny's space with the confidence of a conqueror claiming new territory. They cooked dinner together, or rather, Rob cooked while Penny watched, her usual kitchen competence relegated to the role of admiring audience. The weekend revealed the true sophistication of Rob's psychological warfare. Saturday morning, instead of Penny's sacred solo ritual of greeting the sunrise, Rob emerged onto her balcony, carrying 2 cups of coffee and positioning himself behind her as she checked her plants. His arms encircled her waist, his chin rested on her shoulder, and to any observer, it would have looked like intimate domesticity. But Greg recognized it for what it was, territorial marking, the slow erosion of her independent routines through the seemingly romantic gesture of shared moments. Sunday brought the first visible signs of Penny's transformation, and they broke Greg's heart in ways he hadn't known were possible. Her morning routine, the peaceful meditative garden tending that had been sacred for 6 years, was now hurried and distracted. Instead of her usual gentle humming, she spoke in urgent whispers into her phone, clearly trying to multitask between her plants and Rob's morning conversation. The serene goddess who had greeted each dawn with graceful ritual was being replaced by an anxious woman trying to please a man whose demands grew more subtle and more totalitarian each day. Monday of the second week brought professional sabotage disguised as romantic surprise. Rob arrived at Penny's apartment at 5:30 p.m., right in the middle of her usual grant-writing session, carrying champagne and theater tickets for a show that started in 2 hours. Through her windows, Greg watched Penny try to explain that she had deadlines, that the community center funding proposal was due the next morning, that she couldn't just abandon her responsibilities for spontaneous entertainment. Rob's response was a masterclass in manipulative guilt. He'd wanted to surprise the woman he loved, had thought she'd appreciate culture and beauty, was disappointed that work mattered more than their relationship. Within 30 minutes, Penny had closed her laptop, abandoned her half-finished proposal, and was getting dressed for a night out that would leave her scrambling to meet professional obligations the next day. Tuesday brought the first public display of Rob's control, and Greg watched it unfold with the horror of a man witnessing a traffic accident in slow motion. Diamond Rhodes arrived for their usual weekly dinner, but Rob was already there, having surprised Penny with groceries and an elaborate meal he was cooking in her kitchen. Through the windows, Greg could see Diamond's immediate discomfort. Her body language screamed suspicion as she watched Rob command Penny's space with proprietary confidence. The dinner was excruciatingly awkward. Diamond kept glancing between Penny and Rob with barely concealed concern, clearly trying to understand how her independent, self-possessed friend had suddenly acquired such an overwhelming romantic presence. Rob, meanwhile, dominated every conversation, steering topics away from Penny's work and toward their relationship, making sure Diamond understood exactly who held primary position in Penny's life now. The evening ended after barely 90 minutes, a dramatic departure from Diamond's usual 3-hour visits filled with laughter and intimate conversation. As Diamond left, Greg could see her shooting worried glances back at Penny, clearly torn between respecting her friend's choices and intervening in what looked increasingly like a concerning situation. Wednesday brought the systematic dismantling of Penny's creative expression. Yuri Cross arrived with art supplies for one of their regular creative sessions, evenings when Penny would paint or sketch while Yuri worked on her latest jewelry designs, both women creating in comfortable silence or engaged in the kind of rambling conversations that fed their artistic souls. But Rob answered the door instead of Penny, explaining with polished charm that they'd made other plans and wouldn't Yuri mind rescheduling. Through her windows, Greg watched Penny appear behind Rob, her face a mask of embarrassed apology as she offered excuses that sounded hollow, even from a distance. Yuri's expression shifted from confusion to hurt to a dawning understanding that something was very wrong with her friend's sudden transformation. As Yuri left, without the warm hug that usually punctuated their visits, Greg saw her turn back to look at Penny's apartment with the expression of someone watching a friend disappear behind a door that might never open again. Thursday brought the most devastating change of all, the dimming of Penny's essential light. For 6 years, Greg had watched Penny move through her evening routines with unconscious grace, humming softly as she cooked, dancing slightly to music only she could hear, radiating the kind of contentment that comes from living authentically. Tonight, as Rob dominated her kitchen while she stood aside watching, her movements were careful and contained. The spontaneous joy that had made her irresistible was being systematically trained out of her, replaced by anxious attention to Rob's preferences and moods. When she did speak, it was to ask questions. Is this how you like the salad dressed? Should I turn down the music? Would you prefer wine or beer? A woman who had spent years confidently pursuing her vision of community development was now second-guessing every choice, seeking approval for decisions she'd been making independently for decades. Friday brought the final, crushing blow to Greg's desperate hope that Penny might recognize what was happening to her. Rob arrived with luggage, expensive matching pieces that looked like they belonged in her apartment about as much as a shark belonged in a garden pond. Through her windows, Greg watched him present the suitcases with theatrical flourish, explaining that he'd thought about it and decided they should take their relationship to the next level with a romantic weekend getaway. Penny's response was everything Greg had feared, immediate, grateful acquiescence to a plan she'd had no part in making. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't mention the community meetings she'd have to miss, didn't seem to consider that accepting such an elaborate gift created obligations she might not want to fulfill. She simply smiled and thanked him for being so thoughtful and romantic. As Greg watched Rob help Penny pack clothes that Rob selected from her closet, he realized with devastating clarity that he was witnessing the systematic murder of the woman he loved. Her body remained, her smiles still appeared on command, but the essential Penny, the independent, joyful, creatively passionate woman who had stolen his heart from across a courtyard, was being systematically erased. By the time they left for their weekend trip, wheeling Rob's expensive luggage toward whatever carefully planned seduction awaited them, Greg Morrison understood that gentle warnings and indirect intervention would never be enough. Rob Spooner was stealing Penny's soul one romantic gesture at a time, and the only man who loved her enough to fight for her was a stranger who didn't even have the right to speak her name. The time for silent protection was over. The time for war had begun. Chapter 5. The Spy Who Loved Her. Sometimes love requires us to become detectives in our own hearts, following clues that lead not to treasure, but to the truth that might save someone else's soul. Kai West arrived at Greg's penthouse at exactly 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, carrying a leather portfolio that looked innocuous enough to be a real estate presentation, but contained the kind of information that could destroy lives or save them. At 35, Kai was the most sought-after private investigator in Miami, specializing in cases that required discretion, thoroughness, and the ability to uncover truths that powerful people preferred to keep buried. She'd worked for federal agencies before going private, and her client list included Fortune 500 CEOs, A-list celebrities, and politicians who needed problems solved quietly and permanently. "Mr. Morrison," she said, accepting the coffee Khalil offered with professional courtesy, "I have to admit, this is one of the more interesting requests I've received. Most people hire me to investigate potential business partners or romantic interests before they get involved. You're asking me to investigate someone who's involved with a woman you've never actually met." Greg felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I know how it sounds, but—" "I'm not judging," Kai interrupted, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I'm just trying to understand the parameters. You want everything I can find on Rob Spooner, with particular attention to his relationship patterns and any history of psychological or financial manipulation. You want documented evidence, not rumors or speculation. And you want it fast." "Exactly." Greg leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "How long will something like this take?" "I've already started." Kai opened her portfolio and spread several photographs across his desk. Rob Spooner, 36, MBA from Wharton. Currently works as a senior marketing executive at Prestige Solutions, a consulting firm that specializes in high-end client acquisition. Annual salary approximately $300,000, plus bonuses that can reach 6 figures. He owns a condo in Brickell, drives a Maserati, and has memberships at 3 exclusive clubs. Greg studied the photographs. Rob at various social events, always impeccably dressed, always with a beautiful woman on his arm. Different women in each photo, but all sharing certain characteristics. Successful, intelligent-looking, the kind of women who wouldn't normally be vulnerable to obvious predators. "On the surface," Kai continued, "he's exactly what he appears to be. Wealthy, charming, well-connected. But when you dig deeper, patterns emerge. In the past 7 years, Rob has had 6 serious relationships that I can document. Each lasted between 4 and 8 months. Each ended with the woman suffering significant emotional and often financial damage." She placed another set of photographs on the desk, before and after shots that made Greg's stomach clench. The before images showed confident, radiant women at the height of their professional and personal power. The after shots revealed hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves, women who looked like they'd been through a war and lost everything that mattered. Victim number 1, Dr. Sarah Chen, cardiac surgeon at Jackson Memorial. Met Rob in 2018. By the end of their relationship, she'd been demoted due to performance issues, lost her savings in a failed investment that Rob recommended, and required 6 months of psychiatric treatment for severe depression. Kai placed a medical report on the desk. She attempted suicide 3 weeks after their breakup. Rob had convinced her that her colleagues didn't respect her, that her family was jealous of their relationship, and that he was the only person who truly understood her potential. When she finally tried to end things, he'd isolated her so completely that she felt she had nowhere to turn. Greg's hands clenched into fists. "Where is she now?" "Recovered, mostly. She transferred to a hospital in Seattle, started fresh. But it took her almost 2 years to rebuild her confidence and professional reputation." Kai pulled out another file. Victim number 2, Jessica Mendez, environmental lawyer and partner at Morrison, Klein and Associates. The irony of the law firm's name wasn't lost on Greg, but he pushed the coincidence aside as Kai continued. Jessica met Rob in early 2019. Within 6 months, she'd left her law firm to start her own practice, a decision Rob encouraged, claiming her partners were holding her back. He helped her find office space, recommended contractors for renovations, even suggested an accountant to handle her finances. "Let me guess," Greg said grimly. The accountant was less than honest. "Completely fraudulent. By the time Jessica discovered the embezzlement, Rob had already moved on to his next target. She lost everything: her savings, her practice, her professional reputation. She's currently working as a paralegal in Tampa, trying to rebuild her career from scratch. The pattern continued through 4 more victims, each story a variation on the same devastating theme. Rob would identify successful, independent women, study their vulnerabilities and ambitions, then systematically exploit both. He used their strengths against them, convincing them to make decisions that seemed empowering, but actually made them more dependent on his support and approval. The most disturbing part, Kai said, placing a final file on the desk, is victim number 6, Asia Knight, venture capitalist and founder of Knight Capital Management. She ended their relationship just 8 months ago. Greg opened the file and immediately understood why Kai had saved this one for last. Asia Knight bore a striking resemblance to Penny, not in specific features, but in the overall impression of intelligence, compassion, and strength that seemed to radiate from her professional photographs. Asia was Rob's most successful target to date. She lost $12 million in a cryptocurrency scheme that Rob recommended, along with her firm, her reputation, and very nearly her life. She's currently in therapy and has agreed to speak with you if you think it would be helpful. Helpful how? Rob's technique has evolved over the years. He's learned from each relationship, refined his approach, become more sophisticated in his manipulation tactics. Asia is the only victim who figured out what was happening before he could complete the destruction. She might be able to help you identify warning signs, predict his next moves. Greg was quiet for several minutes, studying the photographs and documents spread across his desk. Each file represented a life derailed, dreams destroyed, trust shattered by a man who treated emotional devastation like a hobby. "There's something else," Kai said quietly. "I've been tracking Rob's social media activity, credit card usage, and phone records. 3 days ago, he purchased a ring from Cartier. 5 carats, princess cut, approximately $180,000. The words hit Greg like a physical blow. He's going to propose. That's my assessment. Based on his previous pattern, he'll propose when his victim is at peak vulnerability, isolated from friends and family, emotionally dependent on his approval, convinced that he's the best thing that's ever happened to her. Kai gathered the files back into her portfolio. With his other victims, the proposal was the beginning of the final phase. He'd use the engagement to justify increasingly controlling behavior, financial entanglement, and complete psychological dominance. Through his sliding glass doors, Greg could see across the courtyard to Penny's apartment. She was on her balcony, but instead of tending her garden as she used to, she was on the phone, presumably with Rob, while her plants wilted in their neglected pots. "How long do I have?" he asked. Based on his timeline with previous victims, I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks. He'll want to create the perfect romantic moment, probably at a public venue where the social pressure will make it impossible for her to refuse. Kai stood, slinging her portfolio over her shoulder. "Mr. Morrison, I have to ask, what exactly are you planning to do with this information? I'm going to save her. And if she doesn't want to be saved? If she's already too far under his influence to listen to reason?" Greg looked across the courtyard again, where Penny was now heading back inside, her phone call apparently finished. Even from his distance, he could see the change in her posture, the slight slump in her shoulders, the way she moved without her usual fluid grace. 3 weeks with Rob Spooner had already begun to dim the light that had drawn Greg's love for 6 years. "Then I'll save her anyway," he said quietly, "even if she hates me for it, even if she never forgives me. Love isn't about being appreciated. It's about doing what's right, regardless of the cost." Kai studied his face for a long moment. "You really love her, don't you? This woman you've never actually spoken to." More than my own life. Then you'd better be prepared for the possibility that saving her might mean losing any chance of ever being with her. If you expose Rob publicly, she'll be humiliated. If you reveal how you got your information, she'll feel violated. Either way, she might never trust another man again, including you. Greg had already considered this possibility during the sleepless nights he'd spent planning his strategy. Saving Penny might mean sacrificing any hope of a future with her, but that was a price he was willing to pay. Better to love her from a distance and know she was safe than to watch Rob Spooner destroy her soul for entertainment. "I understand," he said. "When can I meet with Asia Knight?" "This afternoon, if you're ready. She's eager to help prevent what happened to her from happening to someone else." Kai paused at the door. "Mr. Morrison, what you're planning to do, it's going to require perfect timing, absolute proof, and probably a good lawyer. Are you sure you're prepared for this?" Greg thought about 6 years of morning vigils, 6 years of falling asleep to the memory of Penny's smile, 6 years of loving someone who didn't know he existed. He thought about watching her cry alone, seeing her light slowly dimmed by a predator's careful manipulation, witnessing the systematic destruction of everything that made her the woman he'd fallen in love with. "I've been preparing for this my entire life," he said. "I just didn't know it until now." As Kai left, Greg returned to his balcony with renewed purpose. Across the courtyard, Penny's apartment was quiet, her sliding doors closed against the afternoon heat. Somewhere behind those doors, she was probably getting ready for another evening with Rob, probably excited about whatever romantic surprise he had planned, probably grateful for the attention of such a successful, charming man. She had no idea that her salvation was already in motion, orchestrated by a man who loved her enough to risk everything, including the possibility of ever holding her in his arms. Chapter 6. The Failed Guardian Angel. The cruelest irony of love is that sometimes the very depth of your feelings makes you the least qualified person to save the one you love. Because desperation sounds like madness, and truth sounds like jealousy. 3 days after his meeting with Asia Knight, Greg stood in the marble lobby of his apartment building at 6:15 p.m., pretending to check his mail while his heart hammered against his ribs. For 6 years he'd dreamed of this moment, standing close enough to Penny Lane to speak to her. Now, watching her struggle with grocery bags and dry cleaning, he felt like he might collapse. Asia Knight's words echoed in his mind. "He'll make her distrust everyone who tries to warn her. The isolation is already beginning. Watch for changes in her routine, her appearance, her confidence." And Greg had seen them all. "He doesn't just isolate you from friends and family," Asia had explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold while she talked. "He makes you complicit in your own isolation. He'll say things like, 'I noticed Diamond seemed a little jealous when I mentioned our weekend plans,' or 'Yuri's been acting strange lately. Do you think she's okay?' He plants seeds of doubt about the people who love you most, then sits back and lets you water them with your own insecurities." The engagement ring was real. Asia had seen similar setups before, always preceded by a period where Rob ramped up his romantic gestures, while simultaneously undermining his victim's confidence in her own judgment. The proposal would come at the moment of maximum vulnerability, when Penny felt most grateful for Rob's love and most uncertain about everything else in her life. "He's probably already started the financial phase," Asia had warned. "Small things at first, suggesting joint accounts for convenience, recommending investments that seem too good to pass up, maybe even offering to pay for things as a gesture of love. By the time you realize you've signed your life away, he owns everything that matters to you." Now, standing in the lobby with his hands shaking as he fumbled with his mailbox key, Greg tried to remember the speech he'd rehearsed. Simple, direct, factual. No mention of the binoculars or the 6 years of observation. Just a concerned neighbor who'd heard troubling things about her boyfriend and felt obligated to share what he knew. The elevator chimed, and Penny emerged carrying a bag of groceries and what looked like dry cleaning. She wore a navy blue dress that Greg had never seen before, structured, professional, the kind of outfit that looked expensive but somehow wrong on her natural grace. Rob's influence, no doubt. Even her hair was different, styled in a sleek bob that hid the gentle waves he'd watched catch the morning light for years. "Excuse me," he said, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. She looked up, and for the first time in 6 years, Penny Lane's dark eyes met his directly. The impact was like being struck by lightning. She was even more beautiful up close, but there was something fragile in her expression that hadn't been there a month ago, a wariness that made his chest ache. "Yes," she said politely, though he could see her instinctively taking a half-step back. Single women in Miami learned to be cautious around strange men in lobbies, and Greg suddenly realized how this must look to her. A man she'd never seen before, lurking by the mailboxes, stammering her name. My name is Greg Morrison. I live in 15B. He gestured vaguely toward the elevators, his carefully rehearsed introduction crumbling under the pressure of her proximity. "I wanted to. That is, I've been meaning to introduce myself. As neighbors. We're neighbors." A small smile flickered across her lips, the first genuine expression he'd seen since she walked in. "Oh, the penthouse. I've always wondered who lived up there. Nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison. Greg, please." He took a breath, trying to summon the courage that had built his real estate empire. "Actually, I was hoping I could speak with you about something important." Penny's expression shifted from polite caution to genuine alarm. "I'm sorry, but that's completely inappropriate. You don't know me or Rob, and making accusations about someone based on rumors." "Please, just listen," Greg interrupted, his desperation making him forget all social boundaries. "I know this sounds insane, but I have proof. Sarah Chen, Jessica Mendez. These are real women whose lives he destroyed. I can show you documentation, financial records, psychological evaluations." "Stop." Penny held up her hand, taking a step back. "This is exactly what Rob said might happen. That jealous neighbors or business rivals might try to poison me against him with lies and conspiracy theories." The words hit Greg like a gut punch because they revealed Rob's strategic brilliance. He'd already immunized Penny against exactly this scenario, framing any warning as jealousy or delusion. She stepped closer, and Greg could see anger building in her eyes. Not the clean anger of someone defending herself, but the complicated anger of someone whose deepest insecurities had just been activated. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Mr. Morrison, but I'm not interested. Rob warned me that this might happen, that jealous neighbors might try to interfere with our relationship because they can't stand seeing me happy." The words hit Greg like physical blows. Rob had already prepared for this exact scenario, had already planted the seeds that would make Penny dismiss any warnings as the desperate jealousy of rejected men. It was brilliant and devastating in equal measure. "Penny, please. Ms. Lane," she corrected sharply. "And I think this conversation is over. Rob was right about men like you, men who watch from a distance and convince themselves they know what's best for women they've never even spoken to." The accusation was so close to the truth that Greg felt his face burn with shame. "You don't understand. I'm not trying to. I genuinely care about your safety. Rob Spooner is a dangerous man who systematically destroys successful women for entertainment. I have proof." "You have nothing," Penny said, her voice rising loud enough to echo off the marble walls. "You have rumors and gossip and whatever sick fantasy you've built up in your mind about my life. You don't know me, Mr. Morrison. You don't know Rob, and you certainly don't know our relationship. I know more than you think." Greg said desperately, abandoning any pretense of casual concern. "I know you used to tend your garden every morning at 7 a.m. I know you work late writing grant proposals at your kitchen table. I know Diamond Rhodes and Yuri Cross are your best friends, and I know Rob has been systematically cutting you off from them. I know you haven't worked on your community projects in weeks because he's convinced you to prioritize your relationship over your career. I know you're watching me." The words came out as a whisper, but they carried the weight of absolute horror. "Oh my God, you're actually watching me." Greg realized his mistake too late. In his desperation to convince her, he'd revealed the very thing that would make everything else he said sound like the delusions of a stalker. The truth, that he'd fallen in love with her from a distance, that he'd watched over her with protective devotion, that every detail he knew came from years of caring observation, sounded exactly like the obsessive behavior of a dangerous man. "It's not what you think," he said weakly, but even to his own ears the protest sounded hollow. "I'm calling the police." Penny was backing toward the elevator, her groceries clutched against her chest like a shield. "And I'm calling Rob. He's going to want to know that his girlfriend is being stalked by her neighbor." "Penny, wait!" But she was already in the elevator, jabbing at the button for her floor with shaking fingers. As the doors closed between them, Greg saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of Rob Spooner, who was systematically dismantling her life, but fear of him, the man who loved her enough to risk everything to save her. 20 minutes later, from his balcony, he watched Rob arrive at Penny's apartment with the speed and urgency of a man responding to a crisis. Through her windows, Greg could see the reunion. Penny throwing herself into Rob's arms, Rob holding her with protective tenderness while she presumably recounted the encounter in the lobby. It was a perfect setup. Greg's clumsy attempt at warning had become Rob's greatest gift, proof that Penny was under threat from unstable men who couldn't accept her happiness. Rob's protective response would bind her to him even more tightly, while simultaneously discrediting any future warnings as the ravings of a known stalker. That night, as Greg watched Penny install blackout curtains across her sliding doors, effectively cutting off his view into her apartment and severing his last connection to her daily life, he understood that he'd made a critical error. His love for her, the very thing that had motivated him to act, had become the weapon Rob would use to destroy any chance of saving her. Across the courtyard, Penny Lane was disappearing behind closed curtains and locked doors, while the man who loved her most stood helpless on his balcony, transformed from guardian angel into the villain of her story. But Greg Morrison hadn't built an empire by accepting defeat at the first setback. If he couldn't save Penny through gentle warnings or direct confrontation, he would save her through the one arena where his resources and determination could overcome Rob's psychological manipulation, the court of public opinion. The real battle was just beginning, and this time Greg would make sure he won. Chapter 7: The Heart's War Council. Love, when pushed to its breaking point, transforms from gentle devotion into strategic warfare, and the battlefield is always the human heart. The conference room on the 38th floor of Morrison Development looked like the command center for a military operation, which, Greg supposed, it essentially was. 6 of Miami's most skilled professionals sat around the polished mahogany table, each bringing a different expertise to what would either be Penny Lane's salvation or Greg Morrison's complete destruction. It had been a week since the disastrous encounter in the lobby, 7 days during which Greg had watched Penny's apartment windows remain sealed behind the blackout curtains she'd installed immediately after Rob convinced her that her neighbor was a dangerous stalker. 7 days of pacing his penthouse like a caged animal, knowing that behind those closed curtains, Rob's psychological manipulation was accelerating toward its devastating conclusion. "The Miami Children's Foundation Gala is in exactly 2 weeks, announced Darius Mitchell, the investigative journalist whose work on white-collar crime had earned him both a Pulitzer Prize and several death threats from powerful men with guilty consciences. It's the biggest charity event of the year. 800 of Miami's wealthiest and most influential people, all gathered in one place with their phones and cameras, ready to document anything scandalous. Darius spread architectural plans across the table, showing the layout of the Perez Art Museum where the gala would be held. Rob Spooner will be there. His company bought a table specifically to showcase their community involvement, and according to my source at Prestige Solutions, he's planning something special for the evening. The proposal, said Malik Stone, the technology expert whose legitimate business in cybersecurity provided cover for his less official skills in digital surveillance. I've been monitoring his communications, legally, of course, and he's coordinated with 3 different vendors for what he's calling an unforgettable moment. Flowers, photography, and a surprise announcement that will cement their future together. Malik pulled up images on his laptop screen, screenshots of Rob's emails and text messages that painted a picture of elaborate romantic planning. He's also arranged for the proposal to be broadcast live on the gala's main screens, supposedly as part of the evening's entertainment. Maximum public pressure to ensure she can't refuse. Shea Blake, the lawyer whose corporate litigation practice had made him intimately familiar with the kind of evidence that would stand up in court, reviewed the documents spread before him. We have testimonies from 6 previous victims, financial records showing a pattern of systematic exploitation, and psychological evaluations that paint a clear picture of narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. The evidence is overwhelming. The problem, added Zion North, the former Secret Service agent whose personal security firm protected some of the most high-profile figures in Miami, is timing. If we move too early, he'll have time to discredit the evidence or disappear. If we move too late, the proposal will have already happened, and reversing a public engagement becomes exponentially more complicated. Nasir Wells, the digital media specialist whose work normally involved creating marketing campaigns for luxury brands, had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting. Now he looked up from his tablet with an expression that mixed excitement with moral uncertainty. "I've been thinking about the approach," he said carefully. "We could leak the information to the press beforehand. Let the story build momentum before the gala. But that gives Rob time to prepare counter-arguments, maybe even flee the city. Or ... He paused, studying Greg's face. "We could wait until the moment of maximum vulnerability, right after he proposes, when she's standing in front of 800 people wearing his ring, feeling like the luckiest woman in the world, and then we detonate the truth like a nuclear bomb." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. The second approach would be devastatingly effective. Rob would have no escape. The evidence would be impossible to dismiss, and Penny would be saved from making the biggest mistake of her life. But it would also humiliate her in front of Miami's entire social elite, documenting her victimization for the entertainment of people who would gossip about it for years. "That's assuming she says yes," Greg said quietly. "What if some part of her already knows something's wrong? What if she refuses him?" Asia Knight, who had joined the meeting as an expert consultant on Rob's behavioral patterns, shook her head grimly. "She won't refuse, not publicly. Rob is too smart to propose without being absolutely certain of the answer." She pulled out her phone and showed them social media posts from Rob's previous victims. "Look at these photos from his other proposals. Jessica in Cabo, Sarah at a rooftop restaurant in South Beach. Every single woman looks surprised but delighted. They all said yes because refusing a public proposal feels impossible, even when every instinct is screaming that something's wrong. By the time they realize they've made a mistake," Asia continued, "they're already trapped by the social commitment. Breaking an engagement requires explanations, returned gifts, canceled plans. It's psychologically easier to move forward with a bad decision than to publicly admit you made one. Greg stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Biscayne Bay. Somewhere out there, across the water and city lights, Penny was probably having dinner with Rob, listening to his carefully crafted stories and feeling grateful for his attention. She had no idea that her salvation was being planned in a conference room by a team of professionals who'd never met her, but were willing to risk their reputations to save her life. "There's something else," Malik said, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. "I've been analyzing Rob's financial records, and there's a pattern that goes beyond the personal destruction. He's been systematically looting his victims' assets and funneling the money through shell companies into offshore accounts. We're not just talking about psychological abuse. This is organized financial fraud on a massive scale." The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of their planning. What had started as an intervention to save one woman had become an investigation into a criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple lives and stolen millions of dollars. "That changes everything," Shea said, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "If we can prove financial fraud, we have grounds for criminal charges, not just civil action. The FBI has a task force specifically for this kind of white-collar crime. But federal investigations take time," Zion pointed out. "Months, maybe years before they build a case strong enough for prosecution. Penny doesn't have that kind of time." Greg turned from the window to face his war council, 6 people who barely knew him but had agreed to help save a woman they'd never met, because sometimes love creates its own moral gravity, pulling good people into its orbit. "We stick with the original plan," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. "The gala, the public exposure, maximum impact at the moment of maximum vulnerability. But we also contact the FBI immediately after. Rob Spooner has destroyed his last victim." "Mr. Morrison," Asia said gently, "you understand that this approach will save Penny, but might also destroy any chance you have of ever being with her. She'll be grateful eventually, but in the immediate aftermath, she'll be humiliated, angry, and probably unable to trust her own judgment about men for a very long time." Greg had thought about this possibility every day for the past week, during sleepless nights when he stared at the ceiling and wondered if love without hope of reciprocation was still worth the fight. "I've loved her for 6 years without her knowing I existed," he said quietly. "I can love her for 60 more years the same way, as long as she's safe and happy. This isn't about winning her. It's about saving her." The room fell silent again as everyone absorbed the pure selflessness of that statement. In a city where most relationships were built on transactions and mutual benefit, Greg Morrison's devotion was almost incomprehensible. "All right, then," Darius said, gathering his papers with the efficiency of a man accustomed to breaking stories that changed lives. 2 weeks to gather final evidence, coordinate with venue security, and prepare for the kind of public exposure that will either make us heroes or destroy our careers. "Actually," Malik interrupted, pulling up a calendar on his screen, "I just received another communication. Rob's timeline is accelerating. The proposal is planned for the gala's VIP reception, right before the main program begins. He wants maximum impact when the social media posts go viral." The revelation didn't change their timeline, but confirmed the stakes. They had 14 days to execute an operation that would determine Penny's entire future. "Can we be ready?" he asked. Zion North smiled with the confidence of a man who'd protected presidents and billionaires from threats far more complex than one sociopathic marketing executive. "Mr. Morrison, for the right cause and the right woman, we can be ready in 6 hours." As his team dispersed to execute their various roles in the most important mission of his life, Greg remained at the window, looking out over the city where Penny Lane was spending what might be her last night of freedom. Tomorrow she would either accept a proposal from a man who would destroy her life, or she would be saved by a team of strangers working on behalf of a love she didn't even know existed. Either way, by tomorrow night, 6 years of silent devotion would finally find its voice, and Penny Lane would learn that sometimes guardian angels worked from the shadows, moving heaven and earth to protect the people they loved most. Chapter 8. When Paradise Burns. The most beautiful destructions are the ones that happen in full view of the world, where truth arrives like lightning and there's nowhere for lies to hide. 2 weeks later, the Perez Art Museum had been transformed into a glittering cathedral of Miami's power elite, where charity and social status merged into a spectacle that would be remembered long after the last champagne glass was emptied. 800 of the city's most influential people moved through galleries lined with contemporary masterpieces, their laughter and carefully modulated conversations creating the kind of symphony that only accompanies serious money and serious ambition. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across designer gowns worth more than houses, while servers in pristine uniforms glided between clusters of guests carrying champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. The air itself seemed to shimmer with importance. This was where careers were made, where political alliances were forged, where Miami's future was decided over hors d'oeuvres and strategic handshakes. Greg Morrison stood near the museum's signature hanging garden, a living wall of tropical flowers that created a vertical paradise beneath soaring glass ceilings. In his hand, a glass of 1996 Dom Perignon remained untouched as his dark eyes tracked movement near the main entrance with the focused intensity of a predator who'd spent 2 weeks preparing for this single moment. His team was positioned throughout the venue like pieces on a chessboard, each member invisible among the crowd of Miami's elite. Zion North, imposing even in formal wear, managed security protocols near the main stage while maintaining the casual demeanor of a wealthy patron interested in modern art. Malik Stone controlled the museum's sophisticated audio-visual systems from a hidden booth, his fingers dancing across equipment that could hijack every screen in the building at the touch of a button. Darius Mitchell mingled with media contacts, his journalist's instincts cataloging which cameras were present and which social media influencers would amplify whatever was about to unfold. Nasir Wells moved through the crowd with professional photography equipment, documenting everything while appearing to be just another event photographer capturing Miami's beautiful people in their natural habitat. 2 weeks of meticulous preparation had led to this moment. Every detail had been rehearsed until it became second nature. Every contingency planned for with military precision. Every piece of evidence verified and cross-verified until their case was absolutely bulletproof. Tonight, in front of the most powerful witnesses Miami could provide, Rob Spooner's reign of terror would end in spectacular fashion. At 8:47 p.m., as if the universe itself had chosen the most dramatic possible timing, Rob Spooner made his entrance. He swept through the museum's glass doors like a king arriving at his own coronation, resplendent in a custom Armani tuxedo that fit him like liquid midnight and probably cost more than most people's cars. Diamonds glittered from his cufflinks, his smile was photographer perfect, and his posture radiated the kind of confidence that came from a man who believed himself untouchable. But it was the woman on his arm who made Greg's heart stop completely. Penny entered like a goddess descended from mythology, wrapped in a gown that transformed her into living art. The dress was midnight blue silk that seemed to have been woven from starlight itself, cut with such perfection that it appeared to have been created specifically for her body and no one else's. The fabric flowed around her like liquid poetry, catching the museum's lighting in ways that made her seem to glow from within. Her hair had been arranged by master stylists into an elaborate creation that showcased diamond earrings the size of small stars, while her neck was adorned with a sapphire necklace that probably cost more than her foundation's annual budget. She looked absolutely breathtaking. She also looked absolutely terrified. Greg could read the signs that others would miss, the slight tension in her shoulders despite perfect posture, the way her smile remained beautiful but never quite reached her eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching. After 6 years of studying her every expression, he could see through the magnificent facade to the woman beneath, someone who was playing a role she'd never auditioned for, wearing a costume that felt like a disguise. Target acquired, Zion's voice whispered through Greg's hidden earpiece. They're moving toward the VIP reception area. Malik, status report. All systems green, came Malik's response, crisp and professional. I have complete control over every screen, every microphone, every piece of audiovisual equipment in the building. We own this space now. Greg watched as Rob guided Penny through the crowd with possessive pride, his hand never leaving her waist, his smile never wavering as he introduced her to Miami's power brokers with the casual ownership of a man displaying his most prized possession. The presumption in his demeanor, the way he spoke about their future together and their shared vision, made Greg's jaw clench with barely controlled fury. They moved through the evening's carefully orchestrated schedule like dancers following predetermined choreography. Cocktails in the sculpture garden, where Rob held court among donors while positioning Penny as his perfect accessory. Dinner in the main hall, where they occupied the most visible table, surrounded by photographers and social media influencers who documented every moment of what they believed was just another glamorous evening among Miami's beautiful people. Between courses, Rob excused himself twice, once to speak with the event coordinator about a special surprise for later, and once to visit what Malik's surveillance had identified as a private jeweler's representative who'd brought something very expensive to the venue in an unmarked case. The engagement ring, the final prop in Rob's theatrical destruction of Penny's independence. At 10:15 p.m., the evening's program began its carefully planned progression toward climax. The museum's main screens displayed a slideshow of the Children's Foundation's achievements, while Miami's mayor delivered remarks about community partnership and philanthropic excellence. But Greg's attention was laser-focused on Rob, who kept checking his watch with the nervous energy of an actor waiting for his cue in the performance of his lifetime. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor announced from the main stage, his voice carrying easily through the museum's perfect acoustics. "Before we conclude this evening's celebration, we have a very special surprise. One of our most generous supporters has asked for a moment to share something important with all of us." The spotlight found Rob as he stood, adjusting his bow tie with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. He helped Penny to her feet with theatrical gallantry, and even from across the venue, Greg could see her confusion. This deviation from the planned evening was clearly a surprise to her as well. "My friends," Rob said, his voice projecting with the trained ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention, 6 months ago I had the extraordinary fortune to meet the most remarkable woman in Miami." The crowd murmured appreciatively as Rob guided Penny toward the stage, 800 phones rising like flowers turning towards sunlight to capture what appeared to be an unscripted moment of romantic perfection. Camera flashes began popping like fireflies as Miami's elite prepared to witness and share what promised to be an Instagram-worthy proposal. "Penny Lane," Rob continued, taking her hands in his as they climbed the steps to the main platform, "has taught me what it means to love someone completely, to want to build a life with another person, to believe in forever." The museum's perfect acoustics carried his words to every corner of the space as the spotlight bathed them in golden light. Penny's smile was radiant but increasingly uncertain. She kept glancing at Rob as if trying to understand the script for a play she'd never rehearsed. And then, with the theatrical timing of a master manipulator, Rob dropped to one knee. The collective gasp that rose from 800 voices was like a physical force, a wave of sound that crashed against the museum's walls and windows. Phones and cameras multiplied exponentially as guests scrambled to document what appeared to be the most romantic proposal Miami high society had witnessed in years. "Penny," Rob said, producing a ring box from his pocket with a flourish that suggested hours of practice. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring he revealed was spectacular. A 5-carat princess-cut diamond that caught the spotlight and threw rainbows across the museum's walls like captured starlight. It was the kind of ring that made crowds gasp and social media explode, the kind of romantic gesture that would be talked about for years. The museum fell silent except for the whisper of hundreds of people holding their breath. Penny stood frozen in the spotlight, her eyes wide with shock, her mouth slightly open as she stared down at the man kneeling before her with a ring that sparkled like captured dreams. This was the moment. This was when 2 weeks of preparation would either save her life or destroy it. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Malik's voice filled the museum through the sound system, and suddenly every screen in the venue shifted from the Children's Foundation slideshow to a photograph of a radiant young woman in a doctor's coat, smiling at the camera with confident joy. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen," Darius Mitchell's voice continued, speaking with the authoritative calm of a seasoned investigative journalist. "Cardiac surgeon, marathon runner, devoted daughter. 5 years ago, she had everything to live for." The crowd's attention fractured between the stage and the screens, confusion rippling through the venue like wind across water. On stage, Rob's confident smile began to falter as he realized something had gone catastrophically wrong with his perfect plan. "This is what Dr. Chen looked like after 6 months of dating Rob Spooner," Malik continued relentlessly, and the screens shifted to a hospital photograph of the same woman, now hollow-eyed and broken, barely recognizable as the confident professional from the first image. "Attempted suicide," Darius's narration continued with surgical precision. "Complete financial ruin, career destroyed, all because she fell in love with a man who systematically destroys successful women for entertainment." The museum erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps as more photographs appeared. Jessica Mendez before and after, then others. A parade of accomplished women transformed into shadows of themselves. Rob was on his feet now, the ring box forgotten on the stage floor as he backed away from screens that were painting him as a monster in front of Miami's most influential witnesses. "This is financial fraud," came a new voice, Asia Knight stepping out of the crowd with the poise of someone who'd survived hell and returned to warn others. "This is systematic psychological abuse. This is robbery disguised as romance." The crowd was in chaos now, 800 people pointing and whispering and pulling out phones to record what was clearly the most scandalous event in Miami social history. Security guards moved toward the stage, but Zion North's team was already in position, ensuring that Rob couldn't escape and that the presentation would continue to its devastating conclusion. "The ring he's offering," Asia continued, her voice carrying clearly through the venue's confusion, "was purchased with money stolen from his previous victims. The romantic gestures, the expensive gifts, the elaborate courtship, all of it funded by the systematic financial destruction of women who trusted him with their hearts." On the screens, financial documents appeared, bank records, wire transfers, a paper trail that connected Rob's lavish lifestyle to the emptied accounts of his victims. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely damning. "Stop this," Rob finally found his voice, pointing at the screens with hands that shook with rage rather than nervousness. This is all lies, doctored evidence, a conspiracy by jealous people who can't stand to see us happy. But his protests were drowned out by his own recorded voice, suddenly filling the museum with crystal clarity through the same sound system that had carried his romantic proposal moments earlier. "She's my most challenging project yet," Rob's voice echoed off the museum's walls, like Judgment Day itself. "Penny's got this annoying moral compass that makes her resistant to the usual financial manipulation. But I've found her weakness. She's desperate to believe someone could love her completely. Once I get that ring on her finger, I'll own her completely. Should be fun to watch her break." The silence that followed was absolute. 800 people stared at Rob Spooner as if seeing him clearly for the first time, watching a predator exposed in the harsh light of truth. The romantic proposal that had begun the evening had transformed into public execution, with Rob as both prosecutor and condemned. On stage, Penny stood motionless, the engagement ring she'd been about to accept lying forgotten on the floor where Rob had dropped it in his panic. Her beautiful gown, which had made her look like a goddess just minutes earlier, now seemed like costume armor that could no longer protect her from the truth. But as the shock settled and reality crystallized, something remarkable happened. Instead of the broken victim Rob had been systematically creating, the real Penny Lane began to emerge. The strong, intelligent woman who'd built a foundation from nothing, who'd faced down burglars with baseball bats, who'd spent years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and faced the crowd with the dignity of someone who just realized she was stronger than her nightmares. "You recorded our conversations," she said, her voice carrying through the museum's perfect acoustics with quiet power. "You called me a project." The accusation hung in the air like a sword, while 800 witnesses waited to see how this unprecedented drama would conclude. Rob opened his mouth to offer more protests, more lies, more manipulation. But before he could speak, FBI agents materialized from the crowd like avenging angels, moving with practiced efficiency to place him under arrest for financial fraud, identity theft, and a dozen other charges that would ensure he never destroyed another woman's life. As Rob was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence to a crowd that now saw him as he truly was, Penny remained on stage alone under the spotlight, surrounded by the wreckage of what she'd thought was love. The most beautiful woman in Miami stood in her midnight blue gown, finally free but completely exposed, while 800 people watched her realize that her perfect fairy tale had been the cruelest lie of all. But in that moment of ultimate vulnerability, something extraordinary began to happen. From every corner of the museum, voices rose in spontaneous applause, not for the entertainment they'd just witnessed, but for the courage of a woman who'd survived something designed to destroy her soul. The ovation built and built until it became a standing ovation. 800 of Miami's most powerful people rising to honor not just Penny's survival, but the strength that had carried her through the darkness back into the light. And in that moment, as applause washed over her like blessing, Penny Lane began to understand that sometimes the most beautiful endings come disguised as the most terrible beginnings. Chapter 9. The Heart's Confession Under Burning Skies. Sometimes the greatest act of love is standing in the ruins of someone else's world and offering your heart as the foundation for something new. The chaos in the museum reached a crescendo as Rob Spooner was led away in handcuffs, his protests and denials echoing off the contemporary art that surrounded Miami's elite like silent witnesses to his downfall. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks, social media notifications chimed like a digital symphony, and 800 voices rose in a cacophony of shock, outrage, and the kind of scandalous excitement that would fuel gossip for years. But Greg Morrison had eyes only for the woman standing alone on the stage. Penny stood motionless under the harsh spotlight, still wearing the midnight blue gown that made her look like a fallen star, her carefully styled hair now slightly disheveled from the emotional earthquake that had just shattered her world. The diamond earrings Rob had given her caught the light as she turned her head, scanning the crowd with the desperate eyes of someone looking for an exit from a nightmare that had become too public to escape. She was going to run. Greg could see it in her posture, the way she gathered the flowing fabric of her gown in preparation for flight, the panic building in her expression as she realized that every person in the room was staring at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. In 30 seconds, she would disappear into the Miami night, and he might never see her again. 6 years of loving her from a distance crystallized into this single moment of choice. He could let her go, preserve the comfortable fiction that she didn't know he existed, continue watching her from his balcony and wondering what might have been. Or he could step into the light and risk everything, his heart, his dignity, his carefully constructed world, for the chance to save the woman he loved more than his own life. Greg Morrison chose love. He moved through the crowd with the determination of a man who had built an empire and now faced the most important acquisition of his career. People parted before him, some recognizing him from business dealings, others simply responding to the intensity radiating from his purposeful stride. As he approached the stage, he could hear Penny's voice, shaky but determined, addressing the crowd that waited for her response to the evening's revelations. "I'm sorry," she was saying, her words barely audible over the venue's chaos. "I'm so sorry that you all had to witness this. I had no idea. I never would have." "Don't apologize." Greg's voice cut through the noise as he climbed the steps to the stage, and for the second time in 6 years, Penny Lane's eyes met his directly. This time, however, instead of the polite wariness she'd shown in their building's lobby, her expression held pure confusion mixed with dawning recognition. "You," she whispered, taking a step back. "You're the man from the lobby. The one who tried to warn you," Greg finished, moving closer despite her obvious desire to flee. "The one who's been watching you for 6 years, not because he's a stalker, but because he fell in love with your kindness before he ever heard your voice." The museum had gone eerily quiet, 800 people recognizing that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than Rob's exposure. They were watching a love story unfold in real time, raw and desperate, and completely unscripted. "This was you," Penny said, her voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "All of this, the investigation, the evidence, the public humiliation, this was your doing. Yes?" Greg didn't try to deny it or soften the truth. "Every bit of it. I spent 2 weeks gathering evidence, hired the best investigators in Miami, and orchestrated tonight's exposure because I couldn't stand watching him destroy you the way he destroyed all the others." Penny's eyes blazed with a mixture of gratitude and fury that made her even more beautiful in the harsh spotlight. "You had no right. You had no right to make that decision for me, to humiliate me in front of—" She gestured at the crowd of wealthy spectators. "In front of everyone who matters in this city." "You're right," Greg said simply. "I had no right at all. I'm just a man who's been in love with you for so long that watching you with him was killing me. But not because I wanted you for myself, because I knew what he was going to do to you." Rob, who had been struggling against the FBI agents escorting him toward the exit, suddenly broke free and lunged back toward the stage. His perfect composure had shattered completely, revealing the rage and possessive fury that had always lurked beneath his charming facade. "You had no right," Greg said, his voice carrying across the museum with quiet authority that silenced even the murmuring crowd. "She was never yours. You don't love her. You don't even know her. You see only the victim you were creating through manipulation and psychological abuse, but you never discovered who she really is." Greg turned to face Penny directly, ignoring the cameras, the FBI agents, everything except the woman whose happiness had driven every decision for 6 years. "I know you," he said, his voice soft but audible to everyone in the venue. "I know that you hum without realizing it while you tend your garden each morning. I know you work until dawn when you're passionate about a project, surviving on determination and coffee. I know you cry during romantic movies but pretend you don't, and you dance when you think no one is watching." Penny's anger was wavering, replaced by something that looked like wonder, as she listened to this stranger recite the intimate details of her daily life with loving precision. "I know you're afraid of thunderstorms, but you stand on your balcony during them anyway, because you think the lightning is beautiful. I know you give money to homeless veterans even when you barely have enough for groceries, and you send birthday cards to your friends' children every year without fail. I know you believe in true love even though you've never experienced it, and you'd rather spend Friday night reading romance novels than going to clubs because you're waiting for something real." The crowd was completely silent now, captivated by this unprecedented display of devotion from a man whose reputation for privacy was legendary throughout Miami's business community. "I know all of this," Greg continued, "because I've been watching you with love, not studying you for weaknesses to exploit. I've been your guardian angel for 6 years, making anonymous donations to your foundation, ensuring your building's security system worked properly, calling the police when that man tried to break into your apartment 2 years ago." Penny gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "That was you." The anonymous tip that caught him. "I couldn't sleep that night until I knew you were safe." Greg's voice broke slightly, 6 years of suppressed emotion finally finding its voice. "I've loved you from a distance because I was too much of a coward to risk your rejection, too afraid that knowing me would somehow diminish the joy you bring to the world. But watching him with you," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "watching him systematically destroy everything beautiful about you, turn your kindness into weakness, your trust into a weapon against you. I couldn't be a coward anymore." Rob made another desperate attempt to reach the stage, his voice hoarse with fury. "You're delusional. She doesn't love you. She doesn't even know you. You're nothing but a pathetic stalker who built fantasies around a woman who's been cheating with me, giving herself to me, choosing me over whatever sick obsession you've—" "Enough." Greg's roar silenced Rob completely, and for the first time since the whole nightmare began, his carefully controlled facade cracked to reveal the fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision. "She is mine, not yours. You've been cheating with her heart, her mind, her soul. You've stolen 6 months of her life with lies and manipulation, but you'll never steal another moment." He stepped closer to Penny, close enough that he could see his own reflection in her dark eyes, close enough that she could see 6 years of patient love written in every line of his face. "I should have told you years ago," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent museum. "I should have found the courage to cross that courtyard, knock on your door, and tell you that watching you smile in the morning sunshine was the only thing that made my days worth living. I should have protected you from him instead of hoping you'd figure out on your own that he was wrong for you." Penny's tears came freely now, streaking down her face as 6 years of confusion crystallized into perfect clarity. "The man on the balcony," she whispered. "I always wondered who lived there, who was the shadow I sometimes saw watching the sunrise. I thought maybe you were someone like me, someone who found peace in morning routines and quiet moments." "I was," Greg replied, his own voice breaking with emotion. "I was a man who fell in love with your peace and wanted to protect it, even if I could never be part of it." The distance between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, as if 6 years of separation were collapsing under the weight of finally spoken truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because you deserved better than someone who loved you from hiding," Greg replied. You deserved someone brave enough to court you properly, honestly, without secrets or surveillance or years of unspoken devotion. You deserved someone worthy of your light. And now? Greg looked into her eyes, seeing not the broken victim Rob had tried to create, but the strong, compassionate woman he'd fallen in love with 6 years ago, now fully restored to herself through the truth. Now I'm asking you to forgive me for loving you wrong for so long, he said, and give me the chance to love you right. Without another word, Penny Lane stepped forward, rose on her tiptoes, and kissed Greg Morrison in front of 800 witnesses, choosing love over fear, truth over lies. And the man who had waited 6 years over the one who had tried to destroy her in 6 months. Their kiss was captured by 100 cameras, witnessed by Miami's most powerful people, and broadcast live on social media to thousands more. But for Greg and Penny, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, finally together after years of parallel loneliness, finally speaking the language of love with their hearts instead of their fears. Chapter 10. When Hearts Collide Like Stars. True love doesn't end with a kiss. It begins with one, then writes itself across every sunrise for the rest of eternity. 6 months later, Penny Morrison woke before sunrise in the arms of the man who had loved her from impossible distances. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their shared penthouse, Miami glittered like scattered diamonds beneath a sky painted in shades of coral and gold. She studied Greg's sleeping face, still amazed by the mundane miracle of waking up beside him. His dark hair was tousled from sleep, and there was a small scar on his chin she'd never noticed during all those months when he was just a shadow on a distant balcony. 6 months of marriage had been a revelation, discovering that the man who'd watched her with such devotion was even more complex and fascinating up close. "You're staring," he murmured without opening his eyes, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Learning," she corrected, tracing the line of his jaw with one finger. "I have 6 years to catch up on." He opened his eyes then, and the love she saw there still took her breath away. Not the desperate, yearning love of those balcony mornings, but something deeper and more settled, the love of a man who'd gotten everything he'd ever dreamed of, and still couldn't quite believe it was real. "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison," he said, pulling her closer against his warmth. "I love it when you say that." She settled into the curve of his shoulder, breathing in the scent that had become home. "Though Diamond still insists I only married you for the penthouse view." "Diamond's not wrong," Greg said, his chest rumbling with laughter. "The view from up here is spectacular." They'd moved her herb garden to his balcony, along with the blue vase he'd watched her tend for years. Her morning routine had evolved to include him, coffee for two, shared sunrise watching, conversations about foundation projects that had grown from her small organization into something that could genuinely change lives. "Speaking of views," Penny said, sitting up and reaching for the silk robe draped over the nearby chair, "I want to show you something." She led him onto the balcony where their shared life had begun. The morning air was warm and sweet, carrying the scent of her thriving garden and the salt breeze from Biscayne Bay. From here they could see across the courtyard to her old apartment. Windows now opened wide to morning light, no longer hidden behind the blackout curtains Rob had convinced her to install. "Look," she said, pointing toward the building's entrance where a moving truck was unloading boxes. "New tenants for 10B. They watched a young couple directing the movers, laughing as they tried to maneuver a oversized couch through the front door. The woman looked up at their balcony and waved, the kind of friendly gesture neighbors make when they're happy to be starting somewhere new. "Think he'll watch her from his balcony for 6 years before getting the courage to introduce himself?" Penny asked, waving back. "God, I hope not," Greg said, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "That was the most beautiful torture I've ever endured." "But it worked out." She leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her shoulder blade. We worked out. We did. His voice carried wonder even now, 6 months after their fairy tale wedding on this same balcony. Though I still can't believe you forgave me for the stalking. It wasn't stalking, Penny said firmly, the same argument they'd had dozens of times. Stalking is predatory. What you did was protective. There's a difference between watching someone to possess them and watching someone to keep them safe. She turned in his arms to face him directly. Besides, you weren't the only one watching. Do you know how many mornings I looked up at this balcony, wondering who lived behind those windows? I used to imagine stories about the mysterious penthouse neighbor who was always up before sunrise. What kind of stories? Oh, you know, lonely billionaire, tragic past, probably named something brooding like Maximilian or Damien. She grinned at his expression. Turns out I was only half wrong. I prefer Greg to Maximilian. So do I. Maximilian would never have spent his fortune supporting my foundation anonymously. Maximilian would have expected naming rights and photo opportunities. They were interrupted by Greg's phone buzzing with their morning schedule, foundation meetings, site visits to new community centers, lunch with the mayor about expanding their housing initiative. 6 months ago, Penny had been struggling to fund basic programs with limited resources. Now, with Greg's business acumen and unlimited funding, they were transforming entire neighborhoods. "Ready to change the world today, Mrs. Morrison?" he asked, scrolling through their agenda. "With you?" Always. As they moved inside to shower and dress for another day of building their shared dreams, Penny caught a glimpse of their reflection in the bedroom mirror. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman slowly losing herself to a predator's manipulation, isolated from friends and doubting her own worth. Now she was radiant with purpose and love, part of a partnership that amplified both their strengths. The balcony where their love story had been born in silence would always be special to them. But their real love story was being written now, in every shared decision, every morning conversation, every moment when they chose each other all over again. Some love stories begin with a single glance across a crowded room. Theirs had begun with 6 years of patient devotion across an impossible distance. But the best part wasn't the romantic beginning. It was discovering that the reality of loving each other was even more beautiful than the dream had ever been. The end. In a city of 8 million moments, theirs was the one that proved love doesn't always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it whispers from balconies in the early morning light, waits patiently for perfect timing, and transforms two solitary hearts into something infinitely stronger together. Greg Morrison had learned that the greatest love stories aren't always the ones that happen quickly. They're the ones worth waiting for. And Penny Morrison had discovered that sometimes the guardian angel you've been hoping for has been watching over you all along, just waiting for the courage to step into the light. They lived happily ever after, not because their love was perfect, but because it was patient, protective, and powerful enough to bridge any distance, even the space between two hearts that had been meant for each other from the very first sunrise.